You know, some moments in history, they're more than just events, right? They kind of cut right to the core of things, expose something deeper, something about us, about how we interact with the world, with technology. Chernobyl. Even the name, it has this weight to it, this sense of something immense and almost unbelievable, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about it, the sheer scale of it.
Sure.
The single most devastating nuclear accident in history. April 26, 1986, the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. Pripyat, Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union at the time. It's a date, a place etched in our collective memory, and it's not hard to see why.
Right. It's not just the accident itself, but everything surrounding it, the context, the decisions made, the system that, well, wasn't always the most transparent. And that's what we're going to do today, isn't it? A real deep dive just for you, our listeners.
Exactly. Because we know you're the kind of folks who want to go beyond the headlines, right? You want the details, the intricate workings, the things that often get missed. So that's our mission today, to unravel this event, the sequence of events, the choices, the immediate aftermath, the consequences, the lasting, I guess you could even say, the haunting aspects of it all.
We've gone through historical accounts, analyses, reports, all trying to piece together this story, and it is a gripping one. So let's start with the location itself, shall we? The Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. Yeah. 4 RBMK-1000 reactors, a very particular type of reactor, not your everyday design.
Right, and that's crucial to grasp from the get-go. The RBMK-1000, it was a Soviet design, had this dual purpose, generating electricity, sure, but also producing plutonium. That's a key ingredient in nuclear weapons. So already you see priorities maybe weren't solely focused on safety the way they might be in a purely power-generating reactor.
So plutonium production as well. Interesting. What about the reactor itself? How did it work? The basic principles, so to speak.
Well, it used graphite as a moderator. Imagine that like a material that helps control the speed of neutrons. Those are essential for sustaining the nuclear chain reaction. And then it used ordinary water as a coolant to keep things from, well, getting too hot.
Graphite, water, managing the reaction, keeping things cool. On the surface, it sounds almost elegant, like a delicate balance. So where was the danger lurking?
The inherent vulnerability, the Achilles heel of the RBMK-1000, was its instability at low power levels. It's a bit counterintuitive, but reducing power output could actually make the reactor more reactive. Think of reactivity as how easily the chain reaction starts and intensifies. And at low power, in this specific reactor design, that sensitivity, it was heightened.
Right.
It created what's called a positive void coefficient.
A positive void coefficient.
Yeah, it's a technical term, but imagine trying to slow down a car by gently pushing the brakes, but instead of slowing down, the car starts accelerating. That's kind of what was happening inside the reactor at low power levels.
So the less power it was generating, the more unstable it became. That's unsettling. Was there anything about the plant's structure itself, the physical structure, that played a role in the disaster?
Yes, definitely. Unlike many Western designs, you see, many Western nuclear reactors had these robust containment buildings. Thick concrete and steel, designed to contain any potential release of radioactive material. The RBMK, it had less substantial containment, more like shielding. Not nearly enough to hold back what was about to be unleashed.
All right, so now we're getting closer to that fateful day, aren't we? April 26, 1986, the safety test in reactor number 4. What was the purpose of this test? What were they trying to figure out?
They were trying to test a backup safety system, essentially. The idea was, what if there's a sudden loss of external power? Could the reactor's cooling system still get power from the spinning turbines, that residual mechanical energy? Could it drive the water pumps long enough for the emergency diesel generators to kick in? That's what they were simulating, that crucial window of time.
A test of the backup system. Seems reasonable enough, right? Trying to be prepared. But this is where those fateful decisions started to come into play, isn't it? The decision to run this test at such low power.
Exactly. The protocol required them to reduce the power output significantly, and because of that instability we talked about, that positive void coefficient, it put the reactor in a very precarious state. That was the first major deviation from safe operating procedures, a critical step down a very dangerous path.
And then on top of that, there were operator errors.
Right.
Things being done that weren't supposed to be done. Systems being overridden, even disabled.
Sadly, yes. Control rods, those are used to regulate the nuclear reaction. Well, they were manipulated in ways that violated safety regulations. And then what really amplified the risk, several automatic safety systems were deliberately disabled.
Disabled. On purpose. Why?
The reasons are still debated, but it seems like there was a desire to ensure the test could be completed, without those safety systems interfering. A terrible miscalculation, as we know. It essentially removed multiple layers of protection. Imagine removing the safety features on a high-wire act.
A chilling analogy.
Yeah.
So the reactor, it's unstable, safety systems are off. And then, 1:23 a.m., the unthinkable, the explosions. Wow. Can you walk us through what happened in those terrifying moments?
There was this sudden, uncontrolled power surge. The reactor's power output spiked dramatically, leading to extreme, almost instantaneous overheating. The water in the cooling channels, it flashed into steam with tremendous force.
So an initial steam explosion.
Yes, and it was powerful enough to destroy the reactor core itself, and it blasted that 1,200-ton concrete and steel lid right off the top of the reactor. Just imagine the force needed for that.
A 1,200-ton lid launched into the air. The energy involved is almost impossible to grasp. But there was a second explosion, wasn't there? Even more destructive than the first.
Just a few seconds after the first, a second, even more powerful explosion ripped through the reactor building. The exact cause of that second one is still debated, which adds to the, I guess you could say, the mystery of Chernobyl. But the leading theory is that it was a chemical explosion involving the graphite moderator. The graphite was superheated from the first explosion and now exposed to air. It likely reacted violently with the oxygen, further scattering radioactive material everywhere.
Radioactive material, fragments of the nuclear fuel rods, burning graphite. This wasn't just contained within the plant, was it? This went far beyond.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't a local event. The wind carried this invisible cloud of radioactive particles across huge distances. Ukraine, Belarus, Russia bore the brunt of it, but measurable amounts of radiation were detected all over Europe. It really underscored how interconnected we are, how something in one place can have these far-reaching, unseen consequences.
So how did the Soviet authorities respond? I mean, this was a massive event, unprecedented.
That's a key point, their response. There was a definite delay, a reluctance to fully grasp and acknowledge just how bad it was. Information was slow, assessment was even slower, and communicating it to the public, both domestically and internationally, well, that was even slower still. That lack of transparency really made things worse.
And what about those first on the scene? The firefighters who responded, not knowing what they were really dealing with.
Those firefighters, they're true heroes. They rushed in, brave as can be, thinking it was a regular fire. They had no idea about the radiation. Tragically, many received lethal doses, trying to do their jobs, trying to help. Their story is one of courage in the face of an invisible enemy.
And then, in the aftermath, the massive effort to contain this disaster. The liquidators. Who were they? What drove them to take on such dangerous work?
The term liquidators, it encompasses a huge group of people, hundreds of thousands mobilized in the months and years after the accident. Military, scientists, engineers, coal miners, construction workers, medical staff, you name it. Some were conscripted, some volunteered. A sense of duty, maybe a lack of understanding of the risks.
And those risks were considerable, weren't they? The tasks they had to perform.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. Clearing debris, handling contaminated materials, sometimes with very basic protection. Constructing that initial sarcophagus, that concrete and steel shell they hastily built to try and contain the reactor. The coal miners, they dug tunnels under the reactor to install cooling systems, trying to prevent a meltdown into the groundwater. All of it done under extreme conditions with the constant threat of radiation exposure.
Just a few kilometers from the plant, the city of Pripyat. A city built for the plant workers, their families. What became of this community?
Pripyat, it was a modern city, a model Soviet city, bustling with life, about 49,000 people. What's so haunting about it is the delay in evacuation. It took 36 hours after the explosions before the order was given.
36 hours. Imagine that. Going about your daily life, not knowing the invisible threat all around you.
Exactly. For those 36 hours, people in Pripyat lived their lives, breathed the air, completely oblivious, and when the evacuation did come, it was sudden, jarring. Pack a few things, you'll be back in a few days, they were told. A promise, of course, that was never kept.
A ghost city now. And the consequences, they weren't just confined to that immediate area, were they? The impact on health, the environment.
Sadly, no. In the short term, we saw cases of acute radiation sickness, particularly among those first responders. But the long-term effects, those are the insidious ones. Thyroid cancer, especially in children exposed to radioactive iodine, leukemia and other cancers linked to radiation.
And the natural world. The red forest is a chilling reminder of the impact.
A red forest, yeah. The trees, dead from radiation, their needles turned this eerie reddish brown. Beyond that, we've seen mutations in wildlife within the exclusion zone. The soil, the water, they're contaminated, likely for thousands of years. It really makes you think about the lasting legacy, doesn't it?
To try and contain this ongoing threat, they built that initial sarcophagus. A temporary fix, really, wasn't it?
Right. It was built quickly in incredibly difficult conditions.
Yeah.
A concrete and steel shell, but with weaknesses. Always the risk of collapse, of releasing more radiation.
Which is why they built that new structure, that massive arch, the new safe confinement, an impressive feat of engineering. What's its purpose? How long will it last?
The new safe confinement. It's an enormous steel arch, slid into place over the old sarcophagus, encasing the damaged reactor. It's designed to hold for at least 100 years, to buy us time to dismantle the reactor, remove the radioactive material. A long, slow process.
Chernobyl, it wasn't just a technological disaster, was it? The political and social ramifications, especially in the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. Chernobyl, it was a crack in the facade. It exposed the weaknesses in the Soviet system, the lack of transparency, the bureaucracy, the failures in management, eroded public trust. It definitely fueled Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring.
Some historians even argue it played a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union itself.
It's a complex argument, but a compelling one. The loss of faith in the system, the inability to protect its people, it all contributed to the growing discontent that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's demise.
And today, the exclusion zone, largely uninhabited, but not entirely.
Right. Most of the 30-kilometer zone is off limits, but there are these self-settlers, mostly elderly people who've returned to their homes, defying the restrictions. A strange juxtaposition, this ghost city, slowly being reclaimed by nature but still holding the invisible threat, and these few individuals living out their lives there.
Chernobyl, it's a symbol, isn't it? A warning. What lessons should we take from this event, even all these years later?
It's a reminder of the power we wield, the technologies we create, the absolute need for safety, for transparency, for accountability. It shows what can happen when complex systems meet human error. Chernobyl's legacy lives on, not just in the physical scars, but in the way we think about nuclear power, about risk, about responsibility.
And it's a story that continues to fascinate us, doesn't it? The books, the documentaries, the TV shows. Why does Chernobyl hold such a grip on our imagination?
Because it was so profound, so impactful. It changed the lives of countless people, it scarred the environment, it made us confront the invisible, the long-lasting consequences of our actions. And maybe in grappling with the story, we're trying to make sense of it all, to learn from it, to ensure it never happens again.
We've journeyed through this event together, haven't we? From the reactor design to the explosions, the immediate aftermath, the lingering impact. A story etched in history, reminding us of the invisible forces we sometimes unleash and the enduring consequences.
Absolutely. As you think about all of this, ask yourself, what does Chernobyl tell us about our relationship with technology, with power? How do we balance progress with risk, especially when those risks are so immense? And what does it say about responsibility, about how our choices can have these long-reaching effects even generations later?
Profound questions, and ones that I hope our listeners will continue to ponder. If this has sparked your interest, I encourage you to explore further. There are so many resources out there. Historical accounts, scientific analyses, the stories of those who lived through it. Chernobyl is a chapter in our shared history, one that we can't afford to forget.